Hello, beautiful people. You are tuning into the As Above, So Below podcast. My name is Gunnar, and my wonderful co-host, Andrew, on the other side. We are going to move through this podcast quite quickly. However, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. How are we moving? What is movement? Are you moving now? Are you staying in the same place? Likely there's still movement happening. So, without further ado, Andrew, what is movement? How would you define movement?
Well, I'd like to add to that intro and just say by the end of this podcast is that I hope our listeners feel moved as well. And
thank you for that pun.
Of course. So what is movement? Like the way I look at movement from like a very objective standpoint is it's the change of position of one bone relative to the other via a joint, right? So it's literally just bones moving in space, muscles contracting to move those bones, all these things that go into just the physical movement of our body, right? So when we're moving our body, we're usually accomplishing what I would consider to be external tasks, taking out the trash, picking something up off the floor, going for a run. All of these things are tasks or activities we do. And when we do them, we're doing them what I would call this external workspace or the three-dimensional environment that we all live in, right? And the thing is about movement, getting into like an efficiency standpoint, is that if we want to do these external tasks efficiently with low risk of injury, we must have control over our internal environment. So the internal environment is how our body perceives ourselves moving in the external world. I like to think about it as it's literally your nervous system is sensing your limbs in space, and it's creating this three-dimensional map. For all you math geeks out there, it's like not just the y-axis and the x-axis, but there's that z-axis as well. There's those three planes of motion that we're moving in. And our body wants to have clear images, or our nervous system wants to have a clear image of all these potential spaces in this three-dimensional map that we exist in and how to move well in them. And so that in a way, figurative mapping of our space and how our nervous system perceives the external environment, that is what is called the internal environment, right? But the thing with the internal environment, and this is where I do a lot of my work as a coach, helping people move better and get stronger, is people have blind spots on this map. They may not be very competent at moving in a specific space relative to their body, or like a joint relative to their body. And it's like a muddled vision on this map. And the issue is with that is if we have these blind spots, we're not going to have good control of our body in that space. And if we need to accomplish an external task that requires us to move in that blind spot, the likelihood of us doing that task incorrectly or potentially injuring ourselves increases. So it isn't worthwhile, I would say, to work on improving that internal environment. So when you go out and do these tasks in the external world, we can do them as confidently and as capably as possible. When we get into the movement side, you have a question?
Yeah. So what you're saying so far is the movements that you're thinking about are between certain parts of our body. So like our shoulder and our elbow, or our hand relative to our torso, right? Those are movements in that X and Y and Z plane. Mm-hmm. And then you're starting to talk about why we have certain movements, but also movements that maybe we haven't trained yet, right? That's kind of what you're getting at, is like blind spots.
Yeah. And the thing about these blind spots is that no one is necessarily born with having a fully developed three-dimensional map. We're born and that nervous system is kind of like a blank slate. But how we learn to move in that three-dimensional map is by moving in that three-dimensional map. Because you have these things in your joints called mechanoreceptors. They're where, I won't get into the science of it, but basically they create this feedback loop between that joint in space and where your nervous system, your central nervous system, is aware of where that joint is in space. So the more you move that joint in that specific area, the more information is going back and forth between the nervous system and that mechanoreceptor and creating that clear and clearer image. And that's like the science of it, right? But not to get too bogged down with that, but if there's like a muddled message between that communication system, that's what creates poor awareness of someone's internal environment. So did that answer your question there, Gunnar?
Yeah, I see that fitting. And from my own experience as a coach and studying this is we have different organs in our body that serve the purpose of telling our brain, our central nervous system, where we are in space.
Exactly.
And that's also relative to what you're saying before is those internal actions of like, all right, my hand's here. What does that mean for the rest of the chain back to my central nervous system? My chest, my shoulder, my elbow, my hand. Mm-hmm. It's hot. I put my hand on the stove. I have to retract. That's an internal action based on some deliberate task, right?
Exactly. And that information that flows back and forth between the extremity and the nervous system is what's called afferent information, or afferents is what you can call it. And when we, like I said, we have those muddled spots in this three-dimensional map, we don't have strong afferents for that area, that part of space that our body is operating in. And the more afferents we can have, the clearer that image, that three-dimensional image becomes. So when you ask your body to move in a specific space and that three-dimensional map, you can do it confidently and know that your limb or your extremity is going to go exactly where you want it to go in the area that you perceive and expect it to be at. So
I love it.
That comes back to like the next point perfectly is, how do you improve your internal environment? And like I said, there's afferents, or this information that's flowing between these receptors in our extremities and our central nervous system. So the thing is, you got to move your body. You can't move where you can't move. So you have to take that joint, move it into space regularly and practice it, right? So the more you want, or the more you can practice these specific movements and these ways of training your body, the stronger you can have that connection of afferents and the more confident you can be in your body to do the tasks that you want it to do. And then from there, that's the tasks that you want to do or need to do, that's what we would call functional mobility. Yet functional mobility is what I would call a subjective topic, because what's functional mobility for you, Gunnar, as a CrossFit athlete, is not functional mobility for me as a surfer. Or the functional mobility for a stay-at-home, work-from-home worker who sits at a computer all day is not the same functional mobility needed for a stay-at-home mom of 5 kids. And that's where it gets a little bit more subjective. And then, you could theoretically say, like, it would be worthwhile for this individual, based off of your goals and how you want to move in the external workspace, for you to have this type of control of your internal environment, or that type of control of your internal environment. And that's where it gets a little bit more nuanced, and that's where working with the coach can really come into play. Shameless plug right there. Swayze Fitness in San Diego County, if you guys need some help with that. So that's what I would, that lays the groundwork for like the scientific approach to movement, right? We have this map, we have the external environment, we have an internal environment. The better we can create an internal environment that moves well in the external environment, the better quality movement we're going to have. The next thing that I would like to discuss in regards to movement is a little bit more of what I would call the meditative aspects, or in a way spiritual, or some might even say esoteric sense of movement. When I was a younger kid, and I've shared this story before, I was all over the place. I was physically active all the time. My parents struggled to hold on to me. I was just loving that physical exploration of the world, and anything that piqued my curiosity, I was out there physically exploring and doing. this reminds me of a conversation I had last week with one of my clients, and forget exactly how we got onto the conversation, but we were talking in a similar vein around movement, and was telling him how it's interesting if you have ever heard of NLP or neuro linguistic programming. There's main sensory systems that certain individuals in their body prefers to receive information from and improve how they learn. One is audio. So like some people are really good auditory learners. They can listen to a podcast, they can listen to someone lecture and really take on that information well and how they interpret it in their body. Some people are visual. And then the third way that people can take in new information is kinesthetically. So through physical touch and sensation, right? Or movement, right? So when I think of movement in a more meditative sense, in a way, I think of it's like this creative expression. There's so many different ways you can move your body. You can use it as a tool to learn, right? So for me, for example, what I was getting at in regards to the neuro-linguistic programming is that I know about myself is that I'm a kinesthetic learner. Someone can show me how to do something. They can talk to me all day about it. But until I actually start doing it myself, putting my body through the reps and putting in the work and taking that action, that is when I begin to learn, right? And that learning process to me is a creative expression. Every time I get out and I get to move my body in a novel, new way, or even get to refine movement in something that I've already done multiple times before and get better at, all those things are extremely creative to me. It's a creative process and it's a creative learning experience. And that's why I love movement so much. Is just the ways that you can move your body are infinite. And because of that, every day I get to move my body, whether it's teaching people here in the studio, going out in the water and surfing. And I get to have that physical experience of what it's like to create movement. So when I'm basically in some of the highest states of awareness and focus, and I would even say state of calmness in my life, is when I'm in physical movement. When I'm so physically immersed in an activity that I lose track of time. And that's where I really start to see movement as this spiritual tool that we have, in a way, to really tap into, the deeper parts of ourselves and really get into these states of flow and enhance your quality of life. Yes, Gunnar, you have your hand raised?
I do. Thank you for calling on me. So what I just heard from you is not only is the act of learning part of movement and meditation for you, but the being in movement is where you relate to yourself best, right? So if we're thinking about this podcast and the name of it, as above, so below, as above, right? All of these things back and forth, you're able to better regulate your internal environment, those internal actions, when you are moving in physical space.
Yes.
Whether that's water, whether that's being in the studio, whether that's doing yoga in the park, whether that's taking a walk, like those physical actions help you regulate. And in a way, that is the meditation that you're talking about.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%. And to take it to like another level too, and part of my personal philosophy and ideas around the world today is we live in this 21st century environment. People spend so much time at computers, whether it's sitting, they're just inactive, right? And
two-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly. We're inactive. We're not engaging in the physical body in the way that we are designed and evolved to. Like if we think of like the span of, Homo sapien existence, like the form of evolution that we are as basically as human beings, that's only been like the past 100,000 years. And from an evolutionary standpoint, our body has not evolved much since then. Like physically, I from what I understand, what we looked like 100,000 years ago is pretty similar to what we look like now. Yet, the way we live our lives in the 21st century is miles away from how our ancestors were living 100,000 years ago. They were constantly moving their body. They're physically exploring, getting to different positions, jumping, crawling, throwing, doing all these different things. And then, slowly over time, say roughly over the past 10,000 years, agriculture and all these other developments occurred where we eventually got to this point now with modern economies where the value is placed on intellect in our brain, which is great. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we aren't tapping into our movement capabilities like we have evolved to be. And my belief is that has a huge impact on the psyche and the overall well-being of a population. And because people are unfortunately not connecting to that side of themselves and getting into these, what you could say, like these physical flows where they're exploring their body, they're getting in touch with themselves, to developing a heightened awareness of what's going on internally, is that's creating a lot of the whether it's the pain or the lack of health, disease, you could say, in our modern lifestyle. One of the books that I'll just drop right now that really helped me frame this perspective, read this maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. It's called The Story of the Human Body, The History of the Human Body. I always forget exactly what it's, but it's by this guy named Daniel Lieberman. He's a professor of anthrobiology at the Harvard University. He basically breaks down all the reasons why we have the physical adaptations that we have. Everything from the Achilles tendon in your foot, to the big toe, to your teeth, to why we are upright walking beings. And there's a reason for every single one of those things. And he beautifully describes how we now live in this 21st century world where we have mismatched diseases for almost everything that we've evolved to be naturally, whether it's our eyes, whether it's like our teeth and the consumption of sugars and things like that create cavities, to modern footwear and how it's really negatively impacting our posture and our well-being, because naturally humans were meant to be barefoot or literally have minimal surface underneath the bottom of their foot in the ground. And coming back to the sensory nervous system and how you map your body in space, the highest concentration of sensory neurons in your body are in your hands and in your feet. And when you wrap up those areas of your body and you no longer have that physical connection, or you muddle that physical connection of those sensory neurons, that's going to impact everything else in your body. You're going to have low back pain and all these other issues that we talk about in regards to physical movement in the 21st century. So that's my story, and that's my those are like my thoughts on movement. I'm curious, Gunnar, you look intrigued. You look like there's something you might want to add to that. And I know you have you're a movement professional as well, so I'm sure there might be something valuable there to share.
To go back on the idea of meditation, I see this as a learned practice. So if I'm going to get into a place of flow, use that word, or meditation, or the zone, if you're an athlete, that's typically the moniker used, is at first it's not going to be that way. Right? If we think back to childhood development, we can see many, many stages in play of there's only certain reactions that happen at stages of a baby's life, right? We all think of like, all right, the baby reaches out and grabs and clamps on. That is literally the only action the brain knows how to do at that age. The baby doesn't even sense the idea of looking side to side, which you were just touching on in terms of adaptations of the bipedal hominid that we are floating through space on a giant rock. But coming back to that, like, all right, how do I regulate that internal environment? How do I find meditation? Is you're going to have to struggle at some point and be very intent on the lessons that those struggles teach. So for you, Andrew, you're thinking of movement as, I'm going to teach this. I'm constantly thinking about how am I moving my body? How is it relative to the joints in my back and my shoulders and my hips and my knees, all these major places. You touched on grounding, like you have all these sensory neurons in your feet and your hands, and we can grasp a lot of understanding by touching things, by walking on different surfaces, by moving at different speeds on our feet, on our hands. So with that, I love the idea there of you have to struggle to learn these things. And for you, like, where do you see yourself in your development? And maybe it's a circle, hero's journey type of thing where like you learned something, you had to go through the struggle, you came through the darkness, and now you're like, I have this understanding. I'm going to teach others. Like, what are those things that you are most excited about in teaching to help people through those struggles?
Yeah, well, so this really like comes back to like what you were saying about putting the reps in, doing the work, like as far as like the physical action, right? Just going out there and doing something. And this is like what I would leave our listeners with as far as like some final action steps for today. And I'll share how in my life I've experienced this as well. But for me, like surfing is the best example that comes to place right now. And it's most relevant because I just came back from a surf trip to Puerto Escondido down in Mexico. And this is going to mark a little bit over 4 years since I started surfing. When I first started surfing, there was so much suck, to say the least. You go through you take your licks, as they say, you take your beatings out there, whether it's getting hit by the water or figuring out how to make the proper moves. But over time, you get better and better. And how I did that was by putting in the reps, right? You go out there, you physically do maybe a little bit of visualization, you get some coaching as well. And all these things combined together will ultimately manifest in you moving and showing up, or moving in the way that you desire to. So, you could take surfing and you could apply that to that stay-at-home mom of 5, and you could apply that to fundamental or activities of daily life, like movements that carry into daily life, bending over, picking something up off the ground, utilizing your arms to hold your child. All these things are movements that a mom is going to need to be capable and strong enough to do for her children, right? So just like that mom, she might have just had her first kid, and she's now realizing that she needs to develop these skills so she doesn't hurt herself, or she can show up and be the best mom that she wants to be, because that's important to her. Just like I had the same approach with surfing, and realizing that I wasn't going to be great at surfing right at the gate, and it's going to take practice and work to get there. That mom is going to want to have that same approach, that same mentality, like understanding like, hey, this isn't going to happen overnight, but if, I stick with it and I train properly and I train safely and I work with someone, or I take the proper steps to getting better at this, over time, I'm going to be capable. And as that baby gets bigger and bigger, I'm going to be stronger and stronger and more able to be able to give it the nurturing that it needs without compromising my physical health. So that would be like my suggestion to anyone getting started. I wrote down an analogy. It's like someone going into an intro level chemistry class, taking one day of class and then thinking they're a chemist, right? That is unrealistic and doesn't happen. Just like someone walking into the gym, they aren't going to be going in, doing one workout and leaving there expecting them to be the next professional athlete. It takes time. But with that being said, find something you enjoy, practice it regularly and safely, and then just, utilize patience as you develop more and more confidence in your ability to be capable in those ways that you want to be capable. And don't complicate it more than that. Just keep it simple.
I love it. And it reminds me too, like if we're going back to the beginning of this episode, you mentioned we have our math and science nerds, which we are definitely a part of that group. Is, we have laws of thermodynamics, right?
It's more your territory, but yes.
Yeah, but it relates here because, if we have energy at any level, that energy can either go away from us and into something else, or it can come back and continue to grow. So the more we move, we're more likely to stay in motion, which is also different laws of physics. But the idea there is like, there's only so much energy we have. That energy can either just go away from us, or we can choose to use it. And I think that's exactly what you're touching on. Is like, we know that there's things happening in our body. We don't necessarily need to understand why. There's also things outside of us that are happening. We don't need to necessarily understand why, but we do have the choice to move. And if you're going to live your life, you're going to be moving in physical spaces, in psychological spaces. But most importantly, it's a choice. Like, if you want to be healthy, if you want to be stronger, if you want to be there for someone, you will have to move in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well said, Gunnar.
Well, thank you for bringing this topic. We have our takeaways from this episode. However, we'd be really curious to hear what your takeaways are on this discussion of movement. Please like and subscribe to the As Above, So Below podcast. We appreciate all the feedback that our listeners have, and we are very, very grateful for you. With that, catch us on the next episode of the As Above, So Below podcast. I'm Gunnar. We got Andrew here. Peace.
Adios.